Section 1. The Great Devourer and the Shape of Endless Hunger. There is a particular kind of dread that belongs only to the prey that has finally understood what is hunting it. Not the sharp, electric shock of sudden danger, the kind that hits you when a gun goes off nearby or a vehicle skids toward you on a wet road. That is something different, something almost clean in its immediacy. What we are describing here is something slower and quieter and far more fundamental. It is the slow, crawling recognition that settles into the bones over days or weeks, spreading outward from some cold place in the center of the chest. The recognition that the thing coming for you does not hate you, does not desire your suffering, does not even see you as an enemy worth acknowledging. It simply sees you as food, and it has been crossing the void between galaxies, in the dark between stars, where nothing lives and nothing grows, for longer than your civilization has existed, following a scent you never even knew you were giving off. That is the Tyranid. That is the Great Devourer. When the first reports began filtering back to the Imperium of Man from the Eastern Fringe in the 745th year of the 41st millennium, the scholars and strategists and senior commanders who tried to make sense of what was approaching had no framework for it. The Imperium had faced alien threats before, in 10,000 years of brutal, continuous warfare across the breadth of a galaxy that contains somewhere in the range of 400 billion stars. Humanity had cataloged and fought and bled against more species of Xenos than most individual Imperial citizens would ever know existed. The green-skinned, bellowing tide of orc warbands had been a near-constant fixture of Imperial conflict since before the Great Crusade, so familiar in their violence that entire tactical doctrines existed just for fighting them. The cold, surgical cruelty of Aldari raiders was thoroughly documented. The traps they set, and the weapons they wielded, and the particular, maddening way they always seemed to know what you were about to do before you did it. Even the mechanical horrors that would eventually be identified as Necrons had been encountered in isolated incidents, on worlds where the ancient dead had awakened in their metal bodies, and the encounters had been terrible enough. But what the scouts and the survivors and the dying astropaths on Tyran described was something else entirely, something that did not fight for territory, or revenge, or ideological dominance, something that did not negotiate, did not demand tribute, did not retreat when a battle became costly, something that consumed everything, without pause, without hesitation, without any evident experience of satisfaction that might eventually lead it to stop. The Tyranids are not, in the truest sense, a civilization. They are not even a species in the way most sentient beings understand that word. What they represent is an entire ecosystem, a biosphere so vast and so interconnected that it spans an entire fleet of biological starships, trillions upon trillions of individual organisms, ranging from microbes in the soil of a consumed world to creatures large enough to dwarf imperial orbital platforms, and a psychic intelligence so immense that it has no equivalent anywhere in the known universe. Every creature in the swarm, from the smallest hormone-driven gaunt scuttling through the ruined streets of a dying city, to the towering hive tyrant whose mere presence warps the battlefield around it with the pressure of its psychic emanations, is a cell in a body, an organ in a machine, a thought in a mind that does not sleep and does not pause and does not, by any observable measure, feel doubt. The Hive Mind. That is what Imperial scholars call the governing intelligence behind the swarm, and the name is almost deceptively simple for what it actually describes. Imagine every living creature in a Tyranid hive fleet, and a single hive fleet may number in the hundreds of billions of individual organisms, with the largest fleets far exceeding even that, all sharing a single, continuous psychic experience. Not communicating in the way that two individuals communicate, not sending discrete signals back and forth the way a military hierarchy transmits orders through a chain of command, actually sharing cognition, sharing perception, the way individual neurons in a human brain do not talk to each other so much as collectively constitute the act of thinking itself. The hive mind is not a general issuing commands from a distant headquarters. It is not an emperor on a throne, directing agents who carry out its will. It is something closer to the universe's most terrifying example of collective consciousness, a being so distributed and so vast that destroying any single node of it barely registers as an inconvenience. You cannot kill it by killing its body, because it does not have a single body. You cannot break its will by destroying its brain, because the brain is everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, stretched across light years of vacuum in a web of psychic connection that has no single point of failure. What the hive mind wants, as best as any living being has managed to determine after thousands of years of desperately studying a threat they can barely approach without being overwhelmed by the wrongness of its presence, is biomass. Genetic material, the raw biological substrate from which new organisms can be grown, new adaptations engineered, new weapons evolved in the living flesh forges and gene vats of the hive ships drifting overhead like vast, pulsing islands of alien biology. When the Tyranids come to a world, they do not simply kill the inhabitants. That would be almost merciful by comparison. What they do is far more complete. A world consumed by the Tyranids undergoes a process that the Imperium scholars have studied with a kind of horrified academic fascination, piecing together the sequence from the scant physical evidence left on stripped worlds and the testimony of the very few survivors who escaped. First, the vanguard organisms arrive, often seeded months or years in advance. Gene stealers and smaller scout creatures that assess the world's defensive capabilities and begin preparing the biological and psychological conditions for the main invasion. Then the shadow in the warp falls, cutting the world off from all communication, all warp travel, all hope of rescue. Then the swarms descend. And when they leave, the atmosphere has been processed. The oceans have been broken down. Every plant, every insect, every microbe in the soil, all of it, stripped down to its fundamental components and absorbed into the hive, repurposed, recycled, added to the endless biological wealth of the Great Devourer. The world itself begins to be consumed, the rock broken down for mineral content, the geological record of billions of years of planetary history rendered irrelevant. What remains when the hive fleet moves on is a dead rock. An airless, sterile ball of mineral that bears no trace of the civilization that once stood on it, the billions of lives that once animated it, the history that once accumulated in its dust and its stone and its deep places. And somewhere above it, the hive fleet drifts on, already calculating the next feeding ground, already sending its scouts toward the next star, the next system, the next world full of warm, organic richness, waiting to be taken apart. This is what the Imperium of Man faces. This is the thing that has kept the highest councils of Terra in hushed, barely acknowledged dread since the first reports arrived from the eastern fringe, and the magnitude of the threat became undeniable. Because Hive Fleet Behemoth, which broke apart the proud certainties of the eastern fringe and nearly consumed the jewel of Ultramar at the Battle of Macragge, was not the totality of the Tyranid threat. It was not even close. It was a finger, a probe, a tendril extended from something so much larger, so much further out in the void, that no Imperial scholar has yet determined where it actually ends. So the question that drives everything we are going to discuss tonight is this: can something like that be afraid? Can something with no individual ego, no personal survival drive, no single mind that can be overwhelmed by dread, can it actually fear? Can the greatest predator in the known galaxy experience something that we might recognize as the emotion that lives in the space between knowing a threat exists and not knowing how to face it? The answer is yes. But the fear looks very different from what you might expect. And understanding it, tracing its shape and its source and its implications, tells you more about the true nature of this galaxy and the hidden dangers lurking in its depths than almost any other avenue of study in the entire setting. Because the things that give the hive mind something resembling strategic pause are not simply the most powerful military forces in the setting. They are not just the things that kill the most Tyranids in a given engagement. They are the things that represent genuine, structural problems, threats that the endless hunger and endless adaptation of the Great Devourer cannot simply eat its way through, cannot simply answer with the next wave of bioforms, cannot absorb and metabolize and repurpose. Those are the things worth understanding, and that is where we are headed. If you are watching this right now, wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is where you are, drop a comment below. Tell me your location, tell me the time. I love seeing where this reaches, knowing what corner of the world is sitting with these stories tonight. And if you have not subscribed yet, please do. It costs nothing, and it genuinely helps. Section 2. Does the hive mind even experience fear? The nature of strategic dread. Before we can properly talk about what the Tyranids fear, we have to sit with a genuinely strange philosophical problem, one that is easy to gloss over, but becomes more interesting the longer you hold it. Fear, in the way that most beings experience it, is a function of self-preservation instinct. You fear the thing that might kill you because some deep, ancient part of your brain, a part that has not changed significantly in hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, is desperately, urgently interested in the continuation of your individual existence. Fear is personal. It is attached to the experience of being a specific consciousness, with a specific body and a specific life that can be ended. It is the mind's alarm system, calibrated by millions of years of evolution to flag incoming threats and trigger behavioral responses that maximize the probability of survival. The hive mind does not have an individual consciousness in that sense. It has billions of them simultaneously, and it loses individual organisms the way you lose skin cells constantly, without grief, without registering the individual loss as meaningful. The death of a single gaunt, a single carnifex, even a single hive tyrant, none of these register as a personal wound in the way that losing a limb registers for a human being. The hive mind does not have a self in the ordinary sense of that word. It has a collective, and collectives do not fear death the way individuals do. So when we frame this discussion as what the Tyranids fear, we are using the word in a somewhat different sense than the visceral, physiological, deeply personal experience that word normally describes. What we are really asking is this: what does the hive mind actively route around? What forces it to adapt in ways that suggest calculation is going wrong, that outcomes are not meeting expectations, that the standard model of conquest is encountering resistance it was not built to handle? What, in other words, registers at the level of collective strategic intelligence as a genuine, ongoing problem? And there is something else worth establishing before we go further. The hive mind has been surprised before. It has miscalculated. It has deployed a strategy that proved insufficient and been forced to revise. Hive Fleet Behemoth, the first major incursion into the galaxy that the Imperium of Man encountered and named, attacked with massive, overwhelming force, concentrated in a single direction. The strategy was the kind of thing that a mind of enormous power but limited battlefield experience might default to: the biggest hammer, applied to the most attractive target. The hive mind detected the psychic light of the Astronomicon, the massive beacon generated by the Emperor of Mankind that guides Imperial starships through the warp, and drove toward it, straight at it. Through the defended systems of the Ultramarines' home territory, burning through defensive lines at enormous cost, accelerating as the beacon grew stronger. The Ultramarines made them pay for that approach. The Battle of Macragge was desperate, bloody, and came within a hair's breadth of catastrophe for the Imperium. The entire First Company of the Ultramarines, hundreds of veteran warriors in Terminator plate, died to the last man, defending the polar fortresses of Macragge against the tide of organisms that flooded the surface. Marneus Calgar, the chapter master, was reduced to his last forces, fighting in the wreckage of fortresses that had been overwhelmed multiple times and retaken at enormous cost. The scale of the loss on the Imperial side was staggering, but the Hive Fleet's main body was broken. The combination of sustained orbital firepower, Calgar's tactical adaptation, and the eventual arrival of reinforcements shattered Behemoth's primary tendril at the engagement in orbit of the gas giant Circe, where the flagship Dominus Astra drove directly into the heart of the Hive Fleet and triggered its warp drives in a final, devastating act that destroyed both ship and the fleet elements surrounding it. After that roughly 250 years of quiet, the Imperium maintained military presence in the eastern fringe, but slowly, as the decades accumulated and no new incursion came, the political will to sustain that commitment began to erode. The administratum began questioning the expense. Suggestions were floated that Behemoth had been the full extent of the threat. Then came Hive Fleet Kraken, and it was immediately clear that the hive mind had processed the lessons of Behemoth's defeat and changed its approach completely. Where Behemoth had been a single, overwhelming mass driving in one direction, Kraken dispersed into hundreds of smaller, simultaneous tendrils that struck across an enormous front. Genestealer cults vanguard organisms embedded in planetary populations months or years before the fleet's arrival. Members of human communities who carried Tyranid genetic material in their bodies and Tyranid loyalty in their altered minds erupted in coordinated rebellion across entire sectors simultaneously. Planets that the Imperium thought were secure suddenly found themselves fighting internal insurgencies at the exact moment the Hive Fleet's tendrils arrived in their systems. Defenders who should have been bracing for an external assault were instead locked in a civil war that left their defenses in chaos. This was not random. This was adaptation. The Hive Mind had analyzed exactly what had defeated Behemoth, the organized resistance, the concentrated defensive firepower at key choke points, the ability of Imperial forces to fall back to defensible positions and hold, and had built a strategy specifically designed to prevent those defenses from coalescing. And it nearly worked. Kraken pushed deeper into Imperial territory than Behemoth had managed even at the height of its advance, consuming world after world along multiple fronts simultaneously, forcing the Imperium to fight on more fronts than it could adequately defend. The Second Tyrannic War was eventually resolved, and we will get to the details of how and what they reveal, but the point for now is the demonstration that the Hive Mind learns. It processes information about what works and what does not. It adjusts. It improves. That capacity for learning is what makes this next question so significant. If the Hive Mind learns from tactical setbacks, what has it learned from the things it cannot adapt around? What category of threat has forced it to respond with something more fundamental than tactical improvisation? What has presented it with problems that the standard model of more organisms, new adaptations, better strategy simply cannot solve? Those are the categories of genuine vulnerability. And the first one, the one most immediately relevant to the current era of the lore, involves not a military force at all, but a phenomenon, a contamination of the very thing the Hive Mind exists to consume. Section 3. The Shadow and the Flame Chaos as the Hive Mind's deepest logistical nightmare. To understand why chaos represents a structural problem for the Tyranids, rather than just another military opponent to be overwhelmed, you need to understand the fundamental arithmetic of how the swarm operates. The Tyranids do not maintain supply lines from a distant base in the way that Imperial forces do. They do not have manufacturing worlds, producing munitions and equipment that needs to be transported to the front. They are the supply line, the biological material needed to build new organisms, to replace combat losses, to continuously grow and adapt and evolve new bioforms, optimized for the specific threats they are encountering. All of that comes from the worlds the swarm consumes. A Tyranid campaign that is going well is self-sustaining. The organisms lost in one engagement are replenished from the biomass of the previous world. The fleet grows as it advances, becoming larger and stronger with every successful consumption. This model is extraordinarily powerful. It means the Tyranids do not have the kind of logistical vulnerabilities that make most large military forces exploitable. You cannot cut off their supply. You cannot starve them of ammunition or fuel. You cannot break their industrial base, because they are the industrial base. The only way to stop them consuming is to stop them winning, which means you need to be able to win consistently, at scale, for long enough that the swarm depletes itself against your defenses faster than it can replenish from available biomass. But the model has one fundamental requirement that everything else depends on. The biomass has to be viable. It has to be real, organic, metabolizable biological material. The Hive Fleet needs to be able to break it down, extract the genetic templates, absorb the proteins and complex molecules, and feed the biological forge processes that generate new organisms. If the biomass on a target world is somehow made unavailable, unusable, or is absent entirely, then the swarm is fighting at a net loss. Every organism it sends into battle is spent against a prize it cannot claim. This is where chaos enters the picture, and it enters it in a way that the Hive Mind has demonstrably recognized as deeply threatening. When chaos corruption seeps into a world, when the warp pours through the gaps in reality that demonic incursions tear open, when flesh begins to change in ways that have nothing to do with normal biology, when the matter of living things becomes interpenetrated with the raw, energetic substance of the immaterium, the biological content of that world becomes effectively indigestible for the Tyranids. The warp stuff that daemons are made of, and that chaos-corrupted flesh increasingly resembles, is not matter in any conventional biological sense. It does not have the molecular structure that Tyranid metabolic processes can work with. Attempting to consume it would be like a human being trying to eat light. The official lore is quite clear on this point. The raw matter of chaos offers no sustenance to the Tyranids. When a Tyranid swarm fights demonic forces, it gains nothing. Every organism lost against a demonic incursion is a permanent subtraction from the swarm's total biomass reserves, with no corresponding nutrition to offset the loss. This creates exactly the kind of negative return engagement that the Hive Mind's fundamental arithmetic is designed to avoid. And here is the key development that has made this problem acute rather than manageable. The cicatrix maledictum, the Great Rift, the tear across the sky of the galaxy that opened in the early years of the era Indomitus, bisecting the Milky Way from end to end in a wound that has not healed and may never heal. The Great Rift is not simply a military disaster or a disruption to warp travel, though it is certainly both of those things. It is an ongoing contamination of the galaxy's biological substrate. Warp energy pours through the tear continuously, spreading across the surrounding space, seeping into the worlds nearby, infecting populations and ecosystems and entire atmospheres with the taint of the immaterium. For the Tyranids, watching this happen is the equivalent of watching their food supply slowly be poisoned. The worlds that the Hive fleets had been routing toward, the rich biological gardens of populated imperial worlds and alien ecosystems that represented the next several generations of biomass intake, some of these are now chaos-tainted. Some of them are surrounded by warp storms that make approach difficult. Some of them have demonic incursions in progress that mean the Tyranids would need to fight through demonic forces just to access the world's biomass, burning organisms against an enemy that provides no nutritional return. The scale of this problem, from the Hive Mind's perspective, is difficult to overstate. The Great Rift did not just cut off parts of the galaxy from imperial coordination and reinforcement, though it certainly did that. For the Tyranids, it converted a substantial portion of their planned food supply into something they cannot eat. It is, in the most literal and mechanistic sense, an existential threat to the swarm's long-term ability to function. There is also the matter of what happens when individual hive fleets come into contact with chaos-corrupted material during combat operations. There are lore accounts of Tyranid forces encountering demonic incursions and being unable to make use of the battlefield's resources afterward. But more disturbing are the accounts suggesting that Nurgle, the chaos god of disease, decay, and the bittersweet embrace of entropy, has successfully corrupted at least one Tyranid hive fleet. A fleet infected by Nurgle's gifts becomes something that should be impossible. Organisms that are biologically dead, continuing to function, driven by a momentum that should have ceased when their biological processes shut down, spreading corruption to every world they subsequently contact. The Hive Mind's response to a Nurgle-corrupted tendril is the same as a biological organism's response to an infected limb: amputation. Another fleet was sent to destroy the corrupted one. A significant expenditure of biomass and military force, deployed not against any external enemy, but against the swarm's own infected component, spent specifically to prevent the contamination from spreading further. Think about what that demonstrates. The Hive Mind was willing to destroy its own organisms, to spend the resources that would normally go toward expanding the swarm in order to eliminate a source of corruption. That decision implies a calculation that the long-term cost of allowing the corruption to spread was greater than the immediate cost of the amputation. And that calculation reveals, more clearly than almost anything else in the lore, that chaos contamination registers as a genuine strategic priority at the highest level of swarm intelligence. This is the Hive Mind, encountering a problem it cannot adapt its way out of. It cannot evolve an organism that metabolizes demonic energy. The stuff of chaos is not biology. It does not obey the rules that Tyranid adaptation operates within. The entire system of genetic sampling and template extraction and evolutionary refinement that makes the Tyranids so terrifyingly adaptable simply has nothing to work with when facing a substance that behaves according to the rules of a completely different physical regime. The Chaos Gods themselves occupy an interesting position in relation to the Tyranids. The great warp entities Khorne, Tsainch, Nurgle, Slaanesh feed on the psychic emanations of mortal, sentient creatures. on the suffering and the ambition and the despair and the ecstasy that conscious beings generate simply by existing, simply by feeling and wanting and fearing. Tyranids, operating under the collective will of the hive mind, generate almost none of this psychic food. Individual Tyranid organisms have almost no independent consciousness to speak of. They are cells in a larger body, not individual minds with rich inner lives. The swarm does not suffer in ways that chaos can feed on. It does not desire in ways that Slanesh can exploit. It does not rage in ways that Khorne can savor. So there is an interesting mutual indigestibility here. The Tyranids cannot consume demonic matter, and the Chaos Gods cannot particularly benefit from the Tyranids' existence. Neither side can exploit the other in the ways each exploits most of its other enemies. What they are left with is simple competition for the resource both need, the living worlds of the galaxy and the conscious beings on them. The Tyranids need the biomass. The Chaos Gods need the psychic emanations of conscious life. Both require a galaxy full of living creatures, and they are fighting each other for access to that shared resource. In that competition, the Chaos Gods have an advantage the Tyranids cannot simply overwhelm: the ability to corrupt and contaminate the resource before the Tyranids can claim it, rendering it useless to the swarm while simultaneously denying it to any other claimant. A world consumed by the warp is a world that feeds chaos even as it starves the Tyranids. Section 4. Hive Fleet Kronos. The Hive Mind's acknowledgement of a real problem. The clearest possible evidence that the chaos problem has risen to the level of genuine strategic emergency, from the Hive Mind's perspective, is the existence of Hive Fleet Kronos. And understanding Kronos requires us to appreciate just how unusual it is compared to every other Tyranid hive fleet we have ever encountered. Every major hive fleet in the history of Tyranid incursions into the Milky Way has been, at its core, a consumption engine. Behemoth consumed everything in a straight line toward the Astronomicon. Kraken consumed along hundreds of simultaneous fronts. Leviathan consumed the worlds below the galactic plane and pushed upward through territory the Imperium had assumed was safe from attack. Even the smaller, named splinter fleets, Gorgon, Jormungandr, Hydra, and the others, are primarily oriented toward the acquisition and processing of biomass. Their different approaches represent tactical variations on the same fundamental theme: find organic material, consume it, grow larger, find more. Kronos is different. Kronos is not primarily a consumption fleet. Kronos is a hunter. The fleet emerged in the galactic northwest in the era Indomitus, after the Great Rift tore across the sky, and the warp began pouring its corruption into the material universe on an unprecedented scale. From the moment of its appearance, Kronos displayed tactical behaviors that were markedly different from any previously observed Tyranid force. It was not routing toward the richest concentrations of biomass. It was routing toward the most severe chaos incursions. It was seeking out demonic manifestations and warp-corrupted worlds, and fighting them not to consume them, but to cleanse them. To drive out the demonic presence, seal the warp rifts where possible, and make the residual biomass viable for consumption by the following elements of the swarm. This is Kronos' role in the larger Tyranid strategic picture. It travels ahead of Hive Fleet Leviathan, targeting the chaos-contaminated regions that Leviathan would otherwise need to route around, clearing them of demonic presence so that Leviathan can consume what is left. Kronos is, in essence, a specialized organ the hive mind grew specifically to address a problem that its normal approach could not handle. The shadow in the warp that Kronos generates is far stronger than the already formidable version produced by a standard hive fleet. Where the normal shadow is a crushing psychic interference that disrupts communications and overwhelms psychers, Kronos' version operates as something closer to an active weapon against anything with a significant warp presence. Reports from engagements where Kronos' forces have fought demonic incursions describe the psychic field as actively draining spiritual energy from demonic entities, weakening greater daemons to the point where they struggle to maintain their physical presence in real space, and forcing lesser demonic entities to lose cohesion and dissolve entirely. There are even accounts of Kronos' psychic field sealing active warp rifts, forcing the tiers between realities to close, repairing the boundary between real space and the immaterium, not out of any concern for the galaxy's well-being, but purely because open warp rifts contaminate biomass and represent an ongoing structural threat to the swarm's food supply. Tactically, Kronos also fights very differently from the standard Tyranid playbook. The classic Tyranid assault is a combined arms operation built around overwhelming close-range pressure hordes of fast-moving organisms, forcing close contact where their numbers and biological weapons can overwhelm defensive lines. But the forces of chaos that Kronos targets tend to excel in exactly that kind of brutal melee, particularly against opponents who can be driven to rage or despair or other emotional states that the forces of the dark gods feed on. So Kronos, with the Hive Mind's characteristic adaptive efficiency, largely refuses to fight that fight. Kronos forces prefer extreme range engagement. Vast broods of termagants lay down sustained fire from distances where chaos forces cannot effectively return it. Tyranid warriors armed with the most powerful available long-range bioweapons direct coordinated salvos into demonic positions. The crushing weight of the shadow in the warp degrades the demonic forces psychically at the same time that the ranged fire degrades them physically, and the combination creates a remarkably effective, if unconventional, Tyranid tactical profile. The Hive Mind is fighting smart rather than simply fighting big, because fighting big against this particular enemy produces net negative outcomes. The existence of Kronos tells us several things simultaneously about the shape of Tyranid fear, such as it is. First, it tells us that the Great Rift's contamination of the galaxy's biomass is severe enough that the Hive Mind allocated a significant military force specifically to address it, rather than simply routing around the problem or accepting the biomass loss as tolerable. That is a resource commitment that reveals priority. Second, the specialization of Kronos tells us that the standard Tyranid approach, overwhelming consumption, does not work against this category of problem, and that the Hive Mind knows it. The Hive Mind does not create specialist formations for problems it can solve with more gaunts. Third, and perhaps most telling, the entire existence of Kronos is an implicit acknowledgement that the swarm needs the galaxy's biomass to remain free of chaos corruption, that this is a condition of the swarm's survival in the long run, not a minor inconvenience. There is something almost poignant about this. In the grim way the 41st millennium produces things that are almost poignant. The Tyranids came to this galaxy to consume it. They crossed the void between galaxies, survived some transit that should by rights have been impossible, and arrived with an appetite that has already stripped entire worlds to bare rock. And now they find that another force, a force born from the very consciousness of the living beings the Tyranids want to eat, is actively destroying their food supply while they try to claim it. The Chaos Gods and the Tyranids are in direct competition for the galaxy's biological wealth, and neither side can claim it if the other one wins. In that competition, at this particular moment in the setting's history, with the Great Rift open and warp corruption spreading into territory that was previously viable feeding ground, the Hive Mind is losing ground to contamination faster than Kronos can cleanse it. The balance is not obviously in the swarm's favor, and the Hive Mind knows it. Section 5. The Necrons, an enemy that offers nothing and takes everything. If chaos represents the threat of a food supply being poisoned, then the Necrons represent something in some ways even more fundamental from the Tyranid perspective. They are an enemy that denies food entirely, while simultaneously being one of the most difficult military opponents the swarm has ever faced. To understand why this matters so profoundly, you need to think about what the Necrons actually are, and what their engagement model looks like when mapped against the Tyranid model of conquest. The Necrons are not biological. They are what remains of the Necron tier, a species of flesh and blood beings who, millions of years ago, made a terrible bargain with the star gods, known as the Satan, dying of radiation-induced cancers, consumed by envy and resentment of the long-lived Old Ones, who seemed to have everything the Necron tier had been denied. The Necron tier transferred their souls into bodies of living metal necrodermis in exchange for effective physical immortality. The Satan called this a gift. It was a trap. The new bodies were extraordinary, capable of self-repair, immune to disease and aging, powered by ancient technology that has never been surpassed in the galaxy's subsequent history. But the process of transfer damaged the souls, stripped them of much of the emotional richness that had made the Necron tier who they were, and left them increasingly mechanical in their thinking, even if they retained their memories. But the key point for our purposes is this. Necron bodies are metal. They are not biological in any meaningful sense. They do not contain the proteins, the complex organic molecules, the genetic material that Tyranid metabolic processes are designed to harvest and use. A Tyranid organism that kills a Necron warrior has expended biological resources, muscle tissue, secreted venoms, the wear on its weapons, and the calories burned in combat, and received absolutely nothing in return. There is no biomass to harvest from the corpse. There is nothing to feed back into the Hive Fleet's forge processes. Worse, Necron weaponry compounds the problem catastrophically. Gauss flares, the standard weapon carried by Necron warriors, do not simply damage biological targets. They strip matter apart at an atomic level, disintegrating organic material rather than merely killing it. A Tyranid organism killed by Gauss fire does not leave a body. It leaves residue, scattered atomic components that cannot be reassembled into anything useful that the Hive Fleet's biological recycling processes cannot work with. So not only does fighting the Necrons provide no positive biomass return, it actively destroys the Tyranid's own invested biomass, because the dead cannot even be reclaimed. Run the mathematics of this, and the picture becomes very grim from the Hive Mind's perspective. In any other engagement, there is a break-even point, a level of combat losses beyond which the biomass cost of the battle exceeds the biomass available on the target world, making the campaign counterproductive. Below that threshold, campaigns are profitable. Above it, the Hive Fleet is spending more than it gains. Against biological enemies, this calculation almost always favors the Tyranids because their organisms are efficient, numerous, and because even a world defended by sophisticated military forces still contains enormous quantities of non-combat biomass that the swarm can claim when the battle is over. Against the Necrons, every single engagement is on the wrong side of that calculation. There is no biomass to claim when the battle ends. There is no non-combat population to harvest. The tomb world itself, buried in metal and ancient dust, offers nothing the Hive Fleet can use. And every organism the Tyranids send into battle against Necron forces is atomized by Gauss fire, permanently removed from the swarm's reserves. This is not a war the Tyranids can win by throwing numbers at the problem, because throwing numbers at the problem makes the problem worse. The Hive Mind understands this. It has demonstrated this understanding through observable behavioral patterns. By multiple accounts across the lore, Tyranid forces route around Necron tomb worlds when the tactical situation allows it. When Hive Fleets are expanding through a region of space, the presence of dormant Necron tomb installations does not attract the swarm the way that a living world does. The Hive Mind identifies these as unprofitable targets and, when possible, leaves them alone while pursuing richer feeding grounds elsewhere. This is not cowardice in any meaningful sense. The Hive Mind does not experience cowardice. It is pure, cold, strategic calculation applied to an enemy that presents a novel type of problem. The standard Tyranid conquest model engage, consume, grow simply does not generate positive outcomes against Necrons. The Hive Mind knows this, and it routes accordingly, but it cannot always route around the problem. As the Necrons have awakened in increasing numbers, their long slumber, planned to last until the dangerous older races had declined or destroyed each other, has been disrupted by external threats and the general escalating chaos of the current era, as they increasingly occupy and contest territory that the swarm needs to pass through or claim. Confrontations become unavoidable. The figure who understands the Tyranid problem best, among all the beings currently active in the galaxy, may be Sarek, the Silent King of the Necrons. His title, honored by tradition, reflects the fact that the Silent King rules through edicts rather than speech, issuing commands through intermediaries while maintaining an imposing, wordless authority. But his silence has taken on a different quality since his return. Sarek was the last in the line of Silent Kings, the ruler of the Saracon dynasty and the dominant figure of the Necrontyr ruling council, the Triarch, at the time when the fateful bargain with the Satan was struck. He was the one who agreed to the biotransference, the transformation of his entire species from flesh to metal. He was the one who gave his people immortality at the cost of everything that had made them themselves. The guilt of that decision, unimaginable in its weight across millions of years of memory, is the central defining fact of Sarek's existence. After the war in heaven, after the Necrons turned on the Citan who had used them and shattered those godlike beings into fragmented shards, Sarek issued the final order that sent his people to their tomb world slumber and then went into exile. He commanded a planet-sized vessel, a sepulchral engine of extraordinary construction, and left the galaxy, traveled the void between star clusters, went alone with his guilt and his memories and his eternal metal body, wandering the darkness between galaxies for millions of years. During that time, he encountered the Tyranids. What he saw out there, what he experienced, what he observed about the scope and nature of the swarm before it arrived in the Milky Way, has never been fully described. Sarek does not speak of it openly, and the beings around him have learned better than to press the point. But what is known is that the encounter was sufficient to end an exile measured in geological time. Sarek did not return to the galaxy because he had finished grieving, or because the appointed time had come. He returned because he saw something that told him he had no choice. The Tyranids represent a specific existential threat to the Necrons that goes beyond the military problem of an army that is difficult to fight profitably. If the Hive Mind consumes the galaxy's biological life, all of it, every living world stripped and rendered dead, the Necrons lose the one resource that sustains their long-term plan. The dream of flesh. The hope of eventually reversing the biotransference, of finding biological bodies to transfer Necron consciousness back into, of becoming alive again in a way that their immortal metal shells simply are not. The Tyranids eating the galaxy means the Necrons are metal forever, and for beings who have spent millions of years carrying the guilt of what they did to their people, that prospect is its own kind of horror. So Sarek came back. He has been fighting a shadow war against the Tyranid advance since before the Tyrannic Wars even began, in imperial historical terms, manipulating events, reawakening tomb worlds ahead of schedule, forming improvised alliances with the younger races he might otherwise treat as subjects or simply ignore entirely. The campaign known as the Gehenna Campaign represents one of the most remarkable documented instances of this, when the Blood Angels and Sarek's Necron forces, locked in bitter battle against each other in the dusty wastes of a dead world, watched a Tyranid splinter fleet arrive in orbit. They turned simultaneously, without negotiation, without any formal agreement, without any communication beyond the shared recognition of a greater threat, and fought together until the Tyranid force was destroyed. Then they separated, each two depleted to resume the previous fight. That moment captures something about how the galaxy's politics actually work at the highest strategic level, in the shadow of the Tyranid advance. Temporary alliances form not out of shared ideology or mutual goodwill, but out of the cold recognition that some threats have to be faced before old scores can be settled. Section 6. The synapse web structural brilliance with a structural crack. Now we turn to the vulnerability that is arguably the most immediately exploitable in military terms, the one that has generated the most consistent tactical results for anyone who has managed to identify it and apply force precisely, enough to hit it. The synapse web, the psychic network that makes the Tyranid swarm extraordinary and also gives it a structural weakness that clever enemies have found and tested and worked into a killing art over decades of bitter experience. The synapse web is the mechanism through which the Hive Mind projects its intelligence into the physical reality of the battlefield. It works through relay organisms, creatures whose neural architecture is significantly more complex than the standard Tyranid bioform, specifically designed to receive the Hive Mind's psychic signal at range and rebroadcast to the lesser organisms in the immediate area. Hive tyrants, Tyranid warriors, broodlords, these are the primary synapse nodes, and their presence on the battlefield is what makes the difference between a coordinated tactical force and an extremely dangerous but ultimately undirected mob. Without the synapse field in their immediate vicinity, the average Hormigaunt is not a soldier executing orders in a coherent battle plan. It is an animal. It has the drives that evolution and the Hive Mind's bioengineering have built into it: hunger, aggression, the instinct to move toward prey and to kill it. But it has no capacity for the kind of cooperative behavior that makes a Tyranid assault terrifying. A single feral Hormigaunt, or even a horde of them operating without synapse guidance, will charge toward the nearest source of threat or food with single-minded ferocity and no particular consideration for things like flanking attacks, coordinated fire support, or strategic withdrawal when pressing forward would result in unacceptable losses. Feral Tyranids are dangerous. They are physically formidable creatures built for violence, numerous enough to overwhelm defenses through sheer attrition, and their hunger drives them to keep attacking long past the point where a rational being would retreat. But they are far, far easier to deal with than a properly synapse-controlled swarm. They can be herded, they can be killed systematically before they can coordinate attacks from multiple directions. They die to defensive fire rather than adapting to it. The Imperium discovered this principle in the most expensive way possible in the middle of actual combat, reading the lessons from the corpses of their own dead and the Space Marine chapters that developed specializations in Tyranid combat. Most famously, the tyrannic war veterans who emerged from the carnage of the Battle of Macragge refined it into a genuine tactical doctrine: target the synapse creatures, break the web, watch the coordinated, nightmare tide of organisms fragment into disorganized packs. Destroy those packs systematically before the hive mind can route new synapse coverage through other available organisms. In practice, this is extraordinarily difficult. Hive tyrants are not defenseless command posts, standing politely at the back of the formation waiting to be assassinated. They are among the most physically dangerous organisms in the Tyranid arsenal creatures that can tear apart armored vehicles with their biological weapons, project devastating psychic attacks across the battlefield, and move with a speed and aggression that belies their enormous size. They are also, critically, protected. The hive mind knows they are important. It surrounds them with layers of defensive organisms, tyrant guard creatures whose entire biological purpose is to interpose themselves between their hive tyrant and incoming fire. To die so that the synapse node they protect can continue functioning are a consistent feature of any engagement where the hive tyrant is sufficiently threatened. Getting to a hive tyrant requires first fighting through everything it has been given to prevent you getting to it. In the chaotic, overwhelming sensory environment of an active Tyranid assault, with hordes of organisms coming from multiple directions simultaneously, and the psychic pressure of the shadow, in the warp degrading the target selection and coordination of psyker-dependent units, executing a precise synapse kill is one of the most demanding tactical challenges in the game. But it works. And the hive mind's response to its effectiveness reveals something interesting about the nature of the vulnerability. Because the hive mind did not simply armor up the synapse creatures more heavily and make them harder to kill, it made the web denser, more nodes, more synapse coverage at more levels of the swarm's organization, more redundancy built into the system so that losing one node does not create a catastrophic gap, but merely a manageable degradation that surrounding nodes can compensate for. This adaptation is smart. It is the kind of architectural response that a distributed intelligence makes when it identifies a critical vulnerability in its command infrastructure. Rather than making the nodes invulnerable, which is not achievable, it makes the system resilient by ensuring no single node's loss is fatal. But it does not eliminate the vulnerability. It changes the scale of attack required to exploit it. Where previously killing a single hive tyrant might shatter the web in a given sector, now you need to kill 3 or 5. The web degrades gradually rather than breaking catastrophically, but it still degrades, and at sufficient levels of degradation, the behavioral consequences for the swarm are the same. Disorganized, feral organisms that fight with ferocity, but without the tactical sophistication that makes them truly nightmarish. There is a deeper significance to this vulnerability that goes beyond the tactical level. The fact that the swarm requires synapse creatures that the hive mind needs physical, biological relay nodes to project its intelligence into the battlefield at a local level means that the hive mind is not truly omnipresent. It cannot be everywhere simultaneously with full conscious attention. It needs hardware, physical infrastructure, organisms complex enough to carry its signal, located within the right range of the organisms they need to control. That hardware can be found, targeted, destroyed, and the destruction of enough of it degrades the quality of the intelligence, animating the swarm, makes the swarm behave less like a single vast mind and more like a collection of animals, and creates the window through which determined defenders have repeatedly managed to break Tyranid assaults that should by rights have been unstoppable. Section 7. The Arithmetic of Starvation. when the hunter becomes the hunted by mathematics. The most primal vulnerability of the Great Devourer is embedded in its most basic function, in the thing it does better than anything else in the galaxy. It eats. It must eat. And if it cannot eat, if the arithmetic of consumption and expenditure tips the wrong way for long enough, the mathematics of its own existence begin to work against it, with a relentlessness that even the Hive Mind cannot adapt its way out of. To appreciate this fully, you need to understand what a hive fleet is actually doing at the most fundamental biological level. The bioships, the vast living vessels that constitute the spacefaring component of the swarm, are not simply carriers transporting Tyranid organisms from one place to another. They are the organisms. They are the source of most new Tyranid life. Inside the biological vaults of a hive ship, gene banks are maintained for every known Tyranid bioform, and raw biological material consumed from the worlds the fleet has devoured is continuously converted through processes of biological engineering and accelerated growth into new creatures. When you kill 100 gaunts in battle, the hive fleet regrows them from the reserves of biomass in the ships above. When a new threat is encountered, and a new bioform needs to be created to counter it, the genetic templates are adapted in the flesh forges, and within a generation, sometimes within days, new organisms tailored to that specific threat begin emerging from the hive ship's production organs. This is the engine of Tyranid expansion. It is powered entirely by consumed organic material. Without a continuous input of biomass, the engine slows down. New organisms stop being produced. Losses start accumulating without replacement. The swarm's combat power degrades. If the intake deficit continues long enough, the fleet reaches a critical point where it can no longer sustain offensive operations and is thrown back on whatever reserves remain in the ships themselves, at which point the fleet is consuming its own infrastructure, breaking down the ships themselves for the biological material to keep the organisms running. And the end is only a matter of time. The question of how the Tyranids survived the crossing of the intergalactic void, the journey from whatever galaxy they originated in to the Milky Way, is one of the most fascinating and unresolved aspects of the lore. The distances involved are staggering. The nearest major galaxy to the Milky Way is Andromeda, at approximately 2.5 million light-years. At sublight speeds, crossing that distance would take millions of years. Even at the faster-than-light speeds that more suggests the Tyranids can achieve through gravity manipulation rather than warp travel, the crossing represents a journey of enormous duration across empty space. Empty space where there is nothing to eat. How do you sustain a swarm of the scale and biological complexity the Tyranids represent across a journey like that? The answer, as best as can be inferred from scattered lore references, is a combination of extreme biological hibernation and very careful resource management. Deep stasis, a state of biological quiescence so profound that the organism's metabolic requirements approach zero, their biochemical processes reduced to the minimum necessary to prevent cellular decay. We know this is something Tyranid organisms can achieve because we have found evidence of it. Genestealers, primarily, but almost certainly other Tyranid bioforms as well, discovered in states of deep hibernation on dead worlds stripped by previous hive fleets, waiting in absolute stillness for new biomass to appear so that the rear guard can signal for the fleet's return. But a state of near-complete hibernation means the swarm arrives depleted. It arrives with its reserves drawn down. It arrives with an urgency that pure, satiated strategic calculation would not produce, and with a need to start feeding as quickly as possible to replenish what the journey consumed. This may explain one of the most persistent questions about Hive Fleet Behemoth's behavior. The fleet drove directly toward the Astronomicon, the massive psychic beacon emanating from Terra, the strongest signal in the galaxy, with an urgency that seemed almost reckless by Tyranid standards. It charged through the most heavily defended region of the eastern fringe, rather than methodically consuming the outer systems first. It accepted enormous losses from defensive fire in exchange for speed of advance. Military historians of the setting have debated this for decades. Was the Hive Mind simply making a strategic miscalculation, failing to properly account for the defensive depth it would encounter? Or was there something else driving that urgency? The starvation hypothesis is not comforting, but it has a certain terrible logic. A fleet that arrived in the galaxy already running low on biological reserves would need to get to the biggest available biomass source as quickly as possible. The Astronomican's psychic beacon not only guided the fleet toward the Imperium of Man, the largest single concentration of human life in the galaxy, representing the richest possible source of biomass, it was also, in a sense, the smell of food reaching a very hungry predator. The urgency of Behemoth's advance might have been need as much as strategy. If that hypothesis has any validity, it has significant implications for how the Tyranid threat might eventually be contained. Not by defeating the Hive Mind militarily, though that remains the only viable immediate option when the swarm arrives at your door, but by ensuring that when future fleets arrive, they arrive as depleted as possible. Tactics that deny biomass to the swarm during transit and initial approach. Scorched earth strategies that render worlds uninhabitable before the swarm can reach them. Operations designed not to hold ground, but to ensure that holding ground costs the swarm more than it gains. These are not tactics the Imperium has historically been comfortable with, destroying imperial worlds to deny them to. The enemy sits very poorly with the political and theological dimensions of imperial governance, but logic is sound, and there are recorded instances of it being deployed. Inquisitor Kryptman famously used Xenos fauna to strip planetary populations ahead of the Leviathan advance, rendering the worlds nutritionally less valuable to the swarm. The tactic worked, in the narrow sense that it slowed Leviathan's advance. Kryptman was censured and effectively exiled by the Inquisition for the methods. But the biomass denial strategy remains a valid approach, employed carefully and at terrible moral cost for anyone desperate enough to use it. The arithmetic does not lie. An enemy that must consume to survive can be hurt through hunger. The Hive Mind knows this about the galaxy's defenders, and the galaxy's defenders, slowly and at enormous cost, have been learning it about the Hive Mind. Section 8. The something beyond what was the Hive Mind running from. This is where the lore grows uncertain in ways that feel intentional, and strange in ways that feel genuinely, cosmically unsettling. This is the dark place at the edge of the campfire light, the place where even the comprehensive knowledge of the Imperium's greatest scholars runs out and is replaced by inference and speculation and the haunted silence of beings who know what they saw out there and have decided not to. Say, the Tyranids came from outside this galaxy. That much is established and canonical. They crossed the intergalactic void, endured the immensity of that empty darkness where there are no stars and no biomass, and nothing except the occasional lost photon drifting forever in the nothing, and arrived here with a hunger and a purpose and an army that has already stripped entire star systems to bedrock. The question that has hung in the air since the very first days of contact with the swarm, since the Imperium had enough information to start asking it, is why? What drove them here? What could motivate even a species of this scale and this power to leave behind the feeding grounds they had presumably already fully exploited, cross the incomprehensible void, and hurl themselves at a new galaxy? The most straightforward answer is the most chilling one. They ate everything. The home galaxy, whatever it was, wherever it was, the stellar body from which the Tyranids originated, has been entirely consumed. Every world stripped, every ecosystem converted to biomass. Every star system orbited by dead rock rather than living worlds. There is nothing left. The Tyranids entered the void because they had no choice. They were driven out by the one force that can always eventually drive a predator out of any territory, no matter how powerful that predator is, the complete exhaustion of the prey. In this reading, the Tyranids are as much survivors as they are predators. The last living things in a dead stellar body, propelled forward by the biological imperative of a hunger that will not stop simply because the food has run out, crossing the void, not in conquest, but in desperate continuation. Move or starve, consume or die. The mathematics of survival applied at the largest possible scale. But there is a darker version of this story that has lived in the theoretical spaces of the lore for decades, never definitively confirmed and never definitively denied, maintained in that careful ambiguity that the best world-building reserves for the things it wants to keep truly mysterious. The theory, put simply, is that the Tyranids did not just exhaust their home galaxy. They encountered something in it, or fleeing from it, that defeated them, that drove them out. That sent the Great Devourer crossing the void between galaxies in something that, if you apply that word carefully to a hive consciousness, might be called flight. Something out there beat the Tyranids at their own game. Something that the Hive Mind, with all its vast intelligence and all its biological adaptability and all its capacity to evolve new weapons and counter strategies in real time, could not overcome. Something that the Swarm, looking at the cost-benefit calculation of continued engagement, ultimately chose to flee rather than face. If that is true, and there are structural reasons within the lore to think it might be, then the Tyranids are not simply the greatest threat in the known galaxy. They are the galaxy's greatest threat, who themselves have something to fear. Something that they have been putting distance between themselves, and by crossing millions of light-years of vacuum. Something that the void, as empty and terrible as it is, was preferable to facing. The evidence for this reading is circumstantial but genuinely suggestive. The Hive Mind's behavior in this galaxy has, at various points, displayed urgency that does not entirely fit a purely optimizing predator operating in a target-rich environment with no external pressure. Behemoth drove straight at the most heavily defended region of the galaxy without the careful probing of defenses that you would expect from an intelligence of this caliber, operating with no time constraint. Subsequent fleets have pushed deeper and faster than a purely patient accumulation strategy would suggest. The Swarm is moving as though it has somewhere to be. Surek's experience adds a dimension that nothing else in the lore quite matches. The Silent King, traveling the void for millions of years, encountered the Tyranids before they reached the Milky Way. He observed them. He traveled among them in whatever way a being traveling in a vast sepulchral engine observes an extragalactic swarm. He gathered information about what they are and where they come from and what they have done. And then he came back to the galaxy, ended an exile that had lasted longer than most species have existed, because what he saw made staying in the void no longer a viable option. He has not said what he saw. Not fully. Not in terms that the other races of the galaxy have been able to access. The Silent King plays his hand with the patience and opacity of a being who measures strategy in geological epochs. But the urgency implied by his return, the fact that he has since dedicated enormous Necron resources to fighting the Tyranids rather than simply waiting for the younger races to deal with the problem, suggests that what he saw was not merely the approaching hive fleets. It was something about the nature of what is behind the hive fleets, something about what is following the Swarm out here from the intergalactic void. The most unsettling possibility is that the something behind the Tyranids is aware of where the Swarm has gone, that crossing the void has not created distance, but simply relocated the problem, that the Hive Mind is not running toward the Milky Way so much as running through it, consuming as quickly as possible, trying to accumulate enough biomass before the something catches up to matter against it. In that reading, the galaxy is not the Tyranids' destination. It is their last meal before a reckoning. And the Hive Mind's relentless pace, its willingness to take losses that a purely strategic intelligence would avoid, its urgency, all of these make a different kind of sense. Not the confidence of a supreme predator working at its own pace, the desperation of something that knows the clock is running. Section 9. When adaptation is not fast enough, the tactics that have shattered hive fleets, the Hive Mind learns. This has been established thoroughly, and it deserves the emphasis it receives whenever it is discussed, because it is one of the most important and unsettling facts about the Tyranid threat. Each successive hive fleet that has entered the Milky Way has been measurably more sophisticated than the last. Each one has incorporated the lessons of previous failures. Each one has forced the galaxy's defenders to find new responses to new approaches, rather than simply applying the tactics that worked last time. But learning takes time. Adaptation produces countermeasures, and countermeasures require new adaptations in turn. In the gap between a new threat appearing and the hive mind fielding an organism specifically engineered to counter it, there is a window. And in the history of the Tyrannic Wars, those windows have been the moments where the galaxy's defenders managed to impose genuine strategic setbacks on the Swarm. The Battle of Macragay, already mentioned multiple times in this discussion, represents the foundational example. Marneus Calgar and the Ultramarines faced Hive Fleet Behemoth with the knowledge of what they were fighting accumulated from previous engagements at Tyran and the systems the fleet had consumed on its approach. The crucial tactical insight that Inquisitor Kryptman had developed, that the Synapse creatures were the critical nodes of the Swarm's coordination, and that targeting them could break the tactical coherence of the horde, even when the individual organisms remained overwhelmingly numerous, shaped the defensive strategy at Macragge in ways that ultimately made the difference. The polar fortresses held, not because the Marines outnumbered the swarm, they emphatically did not. Not because their weapons were overwhelmingly more effective than the Tyranid bioforms being thrown against them. The losses on both sides were catastrophic. They held because Calgar understood where the web was and systematically attacked it. Hive Tyrant kills were prioritized above all other tactical objectives. When a synapse node fell, the Marines pressed hard into the resulting zone of disruption, creating corridors through the horde where the organisms were behaving like animals rather than soldiers, killing as many as possible before the Hive Mind could route new synapse coverage into the gap. The entire first company died in the process. Every veteran Terminator who went into the polar fortresses came out only as casualty reports. The human cost of the victory was the kind of thing that takes a chapter generations to recover from, and the Ultramarines spent decades rebuilding the capabilities those losses represented. But the fleet's main body was broken, and the knowledge of why it was broken, the tactical principle that Calgar and his surviving officers carried out of that battle, became the foundation of everything that followed. Hive Fleet Kraken arrived approximately 250 years later, and it had incorporated the lesson. The web was denser, the synapse creatures were better protected. The tactical profile had changed to avoid the concentrated defensive confrontation that had doomed Behemoth. Kraken spread itself thin across a vast front, making it impossible to concentrate defensive strength against a single point of attack, and its advance of Genestealer cult infiltration ahead of the fleet made every targeted world fight on two fronts simultaneously. But the Ultramarines and their allies had also learned. Calgar, rebuilt and still commanding, brought to HR4 the institutional knowledge of two tyrannic wars, and the refined tactical doctrine of the tyrannic war. Veterans Marines who had trained specifically for this fight. The cult uprisings were suppressed before the main fleet could exploit the disruption they were supposed to create. The synapse web was attacked with practiced precision. The battle lasted the better part of a year, and the cost was again enormous. But the result was the breaking of Kraken's main body at Icar 4, mirrored by the Aldari of Iyanden, holding their craft world at the price of most of their military strength. The pattern that emerges from these engagements is instructive. The Tyranids adapt, but so do their opponents. Every time the swarm has been dealt a strategic setback, it has been because the defenders identified a structural vulnerability, the synapse web, the biomass arithmetic, the behavioral predictability of an organism that has been optimized for one specific threat, and struggles when that threat is not present, and exploited it precisely and persistently enough to produce results. There are other tactical approaches beyond synapse disruption that have proven consistently effective, and understanding them illuminates other dimensions of the swarm's vulnerabilities. Fire is one of them. Tyranid organisms are overwhelmingly organic, and while the Hive Mind can engineer resistance to many things with enough generations of adaptation, extreme thermal environments are consistently difficult to work around quickly. The Salamanders chapter, with their mastery of flame weapons and their philosophical and tactical comfort with high-temperature combat, have proven particularly effective against Tyranid forces. Not because fire is uniquely devastating to Tyranid bodies, though it is effective, but because it denies biomass. Burned organic material cannot be reclaimed. It cannot be absorbed back into the Hive Fleet's forge processes. Salamander's flame attacks are, in a very real sense, biomass denial operations, and the Hive Mind has been consistently unable to find an effective counter-strategy to an opponent who is willing to burn everything. The Death Watch deserves specific mention here. The Chamber Militant of the Ordo Xenos, composed of Space Marines drawn from dozens of chapters and combining their diverse specializations into carefully configured kill teams, has been one of the most consistently effective anti-Tyranid forces in the setting. Not through mass engagement, a Deathwatch kill team faces a Tyranid swarm the way a scalpel faces a flood, but through precisely targeted operations against specific high-value components of the swarm's structure. Synapse creature assassination, destruction of critical biological infrastructure on approaching hive ships, Operations designed to degrade the intelligence architecture of the swarm before the main assault arrives, creating the conditions under which the mass fighting forces of the Imperium have the best chance of prevailing. These specialized anti-Tyranid tactics represent something important about the shape of the swarm's vulnerability. It is most susceptible to precision rather than mass. The Tyranids can absorb nearly unlimited mass force. Their numbers are such that even the most devastating area effect weapons eventually run out of ammunition against an unlimited tide. But they cannot easily absorb the targeted, intelligent destruction of specific critical nodes. The web breaks under precision. The arithmetic collapses when biomass denial is sustained and effective. The swarm's adaptability is slowed when new threats are eliminated before they can be analyzed and answered with new bioforms. Section 10. The Pharos, the Astronomicon, and the beacon that called doom. There is a particular cruelty built into the foundational story of how the Tyranids came to the Milky Way, and it has nothing to do with any malevolence on anyone's part. It is the cruelty of pure cause and effect. Of a good decision made for entirely the right reasons, producing consequences that no one involved could possibly have anticipated, radiating forward through 10,000 years of history, to culminate in the darkest chapter of the galaxy's biography. The story begins during the Horus Heresy, in the middle of the galaxy's single worst political and military catastrophe before the current era. The Ruin Storm, a chaos-generated psychic disturbance of enormous scale, deliberately crafted by the forces of the traitor Primarch Lorgar to destabilize the entire fabric of the Imperium, had cut off vast swaths of the galaxy from the Astronomicon's guiding light. Navigators were blind. Ships that entered the warp might never emerge on the correct heading, or might emerge centuries later in the wrong place, or might not emerge at all. Communication between the scattered loyalist factions was nearly impossible. In this darkness, Roboute Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, and a being of extraordinary organizational genius, was building something. He called it Imperium Secundus, a second Imperium, a fallback position, a continuation of humanity's civilization, even if the original Imperium at Terra fell to Horus. And to hold this emergency structure together, to allow his scattered forces to navigate toward it, he needed a beacon. That beacon was the Pharos. On a world called Sotha, in the Ultima Segmentum, on the edge of the eastern fringe, there was a Xenos artifact of extraordinary capability, ancient beyond any imperial reckoning, built by a civilization that had been gone for millions of years before humanity's ancestors came down from the trees. The Pharos was a quantum empathic resonance beacon, a device that could project a signal through real space rather than the warp, guiding navigation without reliance on the psychic sea that chaos had made treacherous. It was, in practical terms, a lighthouse that worked when all other lighthouses had been extinguished. What was not known at the time, what was not known by anyone alive, because it was the kind of knowledge buried under millions of years of deep history, was that the Pharos was of Necron construction. One of a network of such devices that the Necrons had seeded across the galaxy during the War in Heaven, infrastructure for their own communications and navigation, lying dormant since the Necrons went to their long slumber. The 8 Cetan shards that powered it were not a coincidence. The Necrons built the galaxy's hidden infrastructure, and one piece of that infrastructure had been sitting on Sotha, waiting, since before the species that now called themselves humans existed as anything recognizable. Guilliman used the Pharos. He had no real choice, given the circumstances, and he could not have known what he was working with. The device guided loyalist forces to Imperium Secundus. It served as a substitute Astronomicon. It did exactly what it was asked to do. Then the Night Lords came. A force of traitor legionnaires, hunting for Conrad Kurz, their Primarch, the Night Haunter, who had fled to Ultramar during the heresy's early stages, tracked the Pharos' signal and followed it to Sotha. They wanted the device, or they wanted to destroy it, or they wanted what came after as a consequence of its destruction. The battle that followed was desperate and costly. And at the climax of that battle, an iron warrior named Barabbas D'Antioch, one of the traitor legion's own soldiers who had remained loyal out of personal conviction and now served the defenders of Sotha, faced an impossible situation. Defeat was imminent. The Pharos was about to fall to the Night Lords. D'Antioch overloaded it. He triggered a catastrophic release of the device's stored energy, a burst that destroyed the attacking forces and saved the day. He died in the act. The battle was won. And the pulse of energy that the overloaded Pharos released screamed outward through real space, not into the warp, but through the material universe itself, propagating by quantum entanglement mechanisms that current imperial science cannot fully explain, and kept traveling. It crossed the void between galaxies. It traveled for 10,000 years, growing fainter, but never fully dissipating, reaching outward into the intergalactic darkness where the Tyranid swarm was crossing the void. The Hive Mind detected it. That burst of empathic psychic energy, resonating with the quantum substrate of the material universe, carried information. It carried the echo of a galaxy full of living, thinking, feeling creatures. It carried the scent of an enormous quantity of biomass. At an address it now knew, the Hive fleets turned toward the Milky Way. It would take nearly 10,000 years for them to arrive. 10,000 years that the galaxy spent in ignorance of what was coming, during which the Horus Heresy ended and the Long War began, and Primarchs died, and civilizations rose and fell, and the Imperium endured through catastrophe after catastrophe. Nobody knew. Nobody could know. The signal had been sent, and the course had been set, but the swarm was still crossing the void, still millions of light years away, still a problem so far in the future that it would not become real for 100 generations. Then Tyran fell, and the Imperium learned what was coming, and the 10,000 years of accumulated ignorance had to be paid for all at once. The specific cruelty of this origin story, the thing that makes it resonate so distinctly within the setting's broader themes, is that no one was wrong. Dantioch made the right decision in the moment he faced. Guilliman used the available tool to preserve as much of humanity as possible during the worst crisis the species had ever faced. The Iron Warrior who died to save Sotha from the Night Lords was a hero by any standard that applies to that word. And one man's heroism, one commander's improvisation with the tools at hand, inadvertently called down the greatest predator in the known universe on the galaxy that his sacrifice was trying to protect. The Pharos connection adds one more layer of recursive significance. The device was Necron-built. The Necrons are the species best positioned to fight the Tyranids, who are the species that the device inadvertently called. Sarek, who knew about the Pharos as a piece of Necron infrastructure, who traveled the void and encountered the Tyranids, who returned to warn the galaxy, he carries the knowledge that the very thing which drew the swarm here was something his people made. The problem, and the people best equipped to solve it, share an origin, separated by millions of years, and the long sleep of an immortal race, with a burden they cannot put down. Section 11. Fear as a Mirror. What the shape of Tyranid vulnerability reveals. We have come a long way through the dark tonight, through the void between galaxies and the cold mathematics of biomass warfare, through the psychic horror of the shadow in the warp, and the deeper horror of what the shadow itself fears, which is the taint of chaos rendering the food supply indigestible. Through the extraordinary political complexity of the Necron situation, and what the Silent King's silent war against the swarm tells us about the shape of the threat. Through the structural crack in the synapse web, and the tactics that have found it and widened it at enormous cost. What does all of this add up to? When you trace the shape of Tyranid fear, when you map the contours of what the Hive Mind avoids, what forces it to adapt in ways that suggest genuine discomfort at the strategic level, what represents not just a military problem, but a fundamental incompatibility with the Tyranid model of existence? What is the picture that emerges? At the immediate tactical level, the Tyranid's greatest vulnerability is the synapse web. The same architecture that makes them extraordinary, the distributed intelligence, the perfect coordination, the ability to project a single strategic will through billions of individual organisms, requires physical infrastructure that can be found and destroyed. Enough synapse kills, sustained and precise, breaks the web. The swarm fragments. Animals replace soldiers, and animals, for all their ferocity, can be handled in ways that soldiers cannot. This vulnerability cannot be fully eliminated without fundamentally changing what the Tyranids are. And the Hive Mind knows this, which is why so much of the swarm's defensive architecture is oriented toward protecting its synapse nodes. At the resource level, the Tyranids are vulnerable to anything that denies biomass. This is the vulnerability that the Necrons exploit. Simply by existing, their metal bodies offer nothing. Their Gauss weapons destroy rather than merely killing. Every engagement against them is a net loss. It is also the vulnerability that effective scorched earth defensive strategies exploit, and that understanding of Tyranid biomass economics has produced some of the most brutal and morally difficult tactical decisions in the setting's history. The hive mind cannot eat its way out of a world with nothing left to eat. At the contamination level, the Tyranids fear, and this is where the word becomes genuinely appropriate, the warp. Not the warp as the Chaos Gods experience it, not as a home or a weapon or a source of power, but as a substance that renders organic material indigestible and therefore represents a direct threat to the swarm's food supply. The Great Rift has made this fear acute. Hive Fleet Kronos exists because of this fear, and its existence is the clearest evidence in the current lore that the hive mind has categorized chaos contamination as an emergency rather than an inconvenience. At the existential level, the Tyranids carry with them the memory encoded in their urgency, in their pace of advance, in the driven quality of their strategic behavior of something they fled. Something in the dark between galaxies, or in the galaxy they consumed before this one, that the Great Devourer chose not to face. The nature of that something is deliberately unresolved in the lore, and that unresolution serves a purpose. Some threats are more frightening when they remain unnamed. Some dangers are most effectively communicated through the behavior they produce in even the most formidable things they encounter. The hive mind crossed the void to reach this galaxy, and the void has something in it, or something is coming through the void behind the swarm, that made the crossing seem like the better option. That is perhaps the most unsettling thing about the Tyranid story in Warhammer 40,000. Not that they are coming, not that they have already consumed whole worlds and will consume many more. Not even that the hive mind is so vast and adaptable and patient that the galaxy may ultimately not be able to stop it. The most unsettling thing is the question of what the hive mind is afraid of. Because the answer to that question implies something that even the galaxy's most terrible predator considers unmanageable. And whatever that is, it is still out there. In the grim darkness of the far future, the galaxy holds itself together against enemies on every front. The endless civil war of chaos, the cold mechanical resurgence of the Necrons, the distant expansion of the Tau, the violent perpetual motion of the Orc incursions, the haunted remnants of the Aldari trying to survive the aftershocks of their own ancient catastrophe. And threading through all of it, consuming worlds along multiple fronts, the Great Devourer advances. But even the Great Devourer looks over its shoulder at the void it crossed to get here. Even the thing that consumes galaxies has something that it does not want to face. Even the swarm of 10,000 suns has a darkness that it moves away from rather than toward. What that says about the universe, about the true scale of existence, about what lies beyond the edge of what any faction in the setting can see or understand or fight, is something the setting wisely declines to resolve. The mystery serves the story. The darkness at the edge of the light is scarier, because you cannot see into it, but it is there, and the Tyranid's behavior tells you it is there, even if nothing else does. The greatest predator in the known galaxy is moving very, very fast. Perhaps there is a reason for that. If this journey through the deep lore kept you company tonight, if you found yourself sitting with these ideas, turning them over, feeling that particular atmosphere of something vast and half understood, please consider giving this video a like. It genuinely helps more than most people realize. And subscribe if you have not already. There is so much more of this galaxy's darkness to explore together. New videos coming, new corners of the lore to move through carefully, the way you move through somewhere ancient and enormous, and only partially understood. Wherever you are right now, whatever time it is where you are reading or listening to these words, rest easy. The swarm is very far away tonight. Extended section. The Gene Stealers, the fear that walks among you before you know the war, has started. There is a dimension to the Tyranid threat that deserves its own careful examination, one that sits at the intersection of the swarm's greatest tactical brilliance and one of its deepest structural vulnerabilities. It is the story of the Genestealer, the Infiltrator, the Scout, the organism that arrives decades before the fleet and begins preparing the ground in ways that the target population can never detect until it is far too late. Genestealers are not what most people think of when they picture Tyranid organisms. The mental image of the swarm tends toward vast hordes of scuttling gaunts and towering biotitans, the overwhelming mass of creatures descending on a world from orbit. Genostealers are something quieter and in many ways more disturbing. They look at first encounter like a biological weapon optimized for speed and lethality in close combat. 6 limbs, 2 of which end in rending claws, capable of tearing through ceramite power armor. A lean, almost insectoid body profile built for rapid movement through confined spaces. Intelligence considerably higher than the standard Gaunt, capable of independent action without synapse coverage in ways that most Tyranid bioforms cannot manage. And a biological trick that sits at the very heart of why they are so dangerous as vanguard organisms. When a Genostealer infects a host through a bite, typically, though the mechanics of transmission are complex, it does not simply make the host sick or kill it. It installs a genetic payload. The host survives, feels essentially normal, shows no outward signs of change. But their subsequent children will carry Genostealer genetic material, and those children's children will carry more. Each generation becomes slightly more Tyranid, slightly less baseline human, or whatever species the Genostealer is infiltrating. By the 3rd or 4th generation, the offspring are visibly alien larger, with the beginnings of the Genostealer's distinctive physical features beginning to emerge. By the 4th or 5th generation, you have what the Imperium calls pure strain genestealers, essentially full genestealer organisms produced through the transformation of a biological lineage, ready to serve as combat assets in the vanguard assault. And here is the critical detail. Every infected individual, every hybrid descendant, is psychically bonded to the Broodlord, the patriarch of the local Genostealer cult, and through it, to the broader psychic network of the Tyranid advance. They are, in a very real sense, already part of the swarm. They do not know this, most of them. The hybridized generations experience their modified drives and loyalties as a kind of deep spiritual conviction, a sense of belonging to something vast and meaningful. They build cults around the patriarch figure. They worship it with genuine religious fervor. They call it the four-armed emperor in imperial-dominated cultures, or give it whatever local theological framework fits the society they are embedded in. They are waiting for the fleet, and when the shadow in the warp falls, and the first bioships enter orbit, they erupt. Internal rebellions, sabotage of defensive infrastructure, targeted assassinations of military commanders, the opening of gates, and the disabling of Vox networks, and the precise, perfectly coordinated dismantling of everything that might make a coherent defense possible. The cult has been in place for years, sometimes for generations, learning every weakness in the target's defenses, and waiting for the signal that the hour has come. This strategy is extraordinarily effective. The combination of internal sabotage and external assault creates the worst possible defensive situation, fighting 2 battles simultaneously, one against an infiltrated enemy you cannot fully identify, and one against an overwhelming assault coming from orbit. Icar 4, during the Second Tyrannic War, came terrifyingly close to falling before the main fleet even arrived, purely because the Genostealer cult had achieved so much disruption that the defenders were already losing when the ships appeared in orbit. But the Genostealer strategy also creates a peculiar kind of vulnerability that the Imperium has, slowly and at enormous cost, learned to exploit. Genostealer cults can be detected, not easily, and not without the specialized resources of the Death Watch, the Ordo Xenos, and other agencies whose entire mission is looking for exactly this kind of infiltration. The metabolic and genetic signatures of hybrids are detectable to sufficiently sophisticated biological analysis. The behavioral patterns of a growing cult, the way infected individuals begin gravitating toward each other and toward the patriarch, can be identified by analysts who know what to look for. Detection means disruption. A Genostealer cult that is found and destroyed before the fleet arrives loses the Hive Mind, one of its most valuable tactical assets. The fleet that arrives at a world where the cult has been eliminated faces full, coherent defensive resistance, without the internal confusion factor. And while a Tyranid fleet can assault a world without Genestealer support, the losses are considerably higher than they would be with the internal disruption already in place. The Death Watch has made cult detection and elimination a primary operational focus. Kill teams that specialize in gene stealer hunting using the biological expertise of librarians, the tracking skills of marine scouts who have spent decades studying alien behavior, and the sheer killing power of the assembled kill team have saved worlds by arriving years before the swarm and finding the infection before it could mature to the point of outbreak. These are thankless, unglamorous operations compared to the dramatic last stands of major fleet engagements, but they represent one of the most cost-effective anti-Tyranid strategies available to the Imperium. What this tells us about Tyranid vulnerability is that the swarm depends heavily on the multi-stage strategy succeeding as a whole. Remove any piece of it, and the efficiency of the operation degrades. Find and eliminate the Genestealer cult, and the fleet fights at higher cost. Identify and target synapse creatures, and the tactical coherence breaks down. Deny biomass, and the whole arithmetic falls apart. No single approach is sufficient on its own, but the swarm's strength is also its design constraint. It is built around a strategy that, if any component fails at the right moment, can be disrupted in ways that create openings for determined defenders. Extended section: the Aeldari, the Webway, and the long game against the swarm. The Aeldari, the ancient, haunted elder race of the galaxy, diminished from the heights of their civilization by the catastrophe of Slaaneish's birth, but still possessed of technology and psychic capability that the Imperium can barely understand, have their own complicated and deeply interesting and close, considered relationship with the Tyranid threat. And examining that relationship reveals additional dimensions of what the Hive Mind finds genuinely challenging. The Aeldari have been aware of the Tyranid approach for far longer than humanity has. They're seers, they're farseers, the psychic visionaries who spend their lives navigating the skein of probability and consequence that underlies the flow of events. Detected the coming of the Hive fleets long before the first Tyranid bioform set foot on an Imperial world. This foreknowledge has shaped Aeldari strategy in this era of the galaxy's history, in ways that are not always visible to the outside observer. The most dramatic example is the defense of craft world Iyanden. Iyanden is one of the great craft worlds, the enormous living starships that the Aeldari built after the fall to carry their civilization through the darkness, vast enough to be cities in space, housing tens of thousands of Aeldari and the spirit stones of their honored dead in the wraithbone construct of the craft world's walls. Iyanden was, before Hive Fleet Kraken arrived, one of the most populous and powerful of the remaining craft worlds. When Kraken's tendrils reached it, Iyanden was almost destroyed. The defense of Iyanden is one of the most dramatic military engagements in the setting's history. The Aeldari of Iyanden, faced with a swarm that vastly outnumbered their living military forces, took a step that their culture has profound reservations about. They awakened their dead. The Wraithguard and Wraithlords, enormous constructs of Wraithbone animated by the souls of dead Aeldari, guided by the connection to their spirit stones, marched in numbers that living Aeldari forces could not have matched. The dead defended the living, Iyanden held, but the cost was catastrophic. Hundreds of thousands of Aeldari dead, their spirit stones destroyed so that the souls within could not be recovered, lost to the nothing forever. The Wraithbone constructs that survived were damaged in ways that will take decades to repair. The craft world, which had before Kraken housed one of the largest and most vital Aeldari communities in the galaxy, was left with a fraction of its former population and a culture struggling with the weight of what the defense had required. Iyanden survived Kraken. But the version of Iyanden that emerged from that conflict was a shadow of what had existed before, haunted, depleted, the ratio of the living to the honored dead, in its spirit halls, inverted from what it should have been. The broader Aeldari strategic response to the Tyranid threat operates on timescales and through methods that the Imperium's defenders find difficult to comprehend, let alone appreciate. The Farseers of various craft worlds have been observed intervening in events that appear unrelated to the swarm, guiding the outcomes of human battles, directing Deathwatch operations against specific targets, making seemingly inexplicable tactical decisions in ways that become comprehensible only with the knowledge that Aeldari seers are reading the skein of probability and steering outcomes toward configurations that will slow or damage the Tyranid advance decades in the future. There is also the matter of the Webway, the Aeldari's private hyperspatial transport network. threaded through real space like a vast network of shortcuts that does not touch the warp, and therefore is not subject to the shadow in the warp's psychic interference. The Tyranids cannot follow the Aeldari into the webway. They do not have access to it. When an Aeldari force needs to disengage from a Tyranid assault, they can step into the webway and be gone before the swarm can react, appearing elsewhere, striking from an unexpected direction, and withdrawing again in ways that the mindless pursuit of a hungry swarm cannot effectively counter. This capacity for rapid, untraceable movement gives the Aeldari a strategic flexibility against Tyranid forces that no other faction in the setting possesses to the same degree. They can be everywhere and nowhere. They can strike the synapse nodes and be gone before the swarm can redirect. They can deliver precise, targeted damage to exactly the most vulnerable points of the Tyranid assault without needing to hold ground against the Horde. The Hive Mind has been unable to develop a reliable counter to webway warfare. It cannot follow into the webway. It cannot predict where attacks will emerge. It cannot adapt bioforms specifically to fight an enemy who is never in the same place long enough to develop a counter strategy against. This is, from the Hive Mind's perspective, a genuine source of strategic frustration, an adversary that can deliver consistent, damaging blows without ever presenting itself for the kind of attrition battle that the swarm excels at. The Aeldari also represent an important data point on the question of what the Tyranids are willing to sacrifice genestealer infiltration strategies against. Aeldari populations on craftworlds are, by the nature of Aeldari culture, extremely vigilant against any form of psychic corruption or alien influence. Their farseers would detect a gene-stealer cult long before it could reach the stage where it poses a military threat. This makes craftworlds extremely difficult targets for the multi-stage infiltration strategy that the Tyranids rely on so heavily against human worlds. The fleet must fight them without internal support, which raises costs substantially. That the Aeldari have survived at all, given the scale of the Tyranid incursions and the various other catastrophes of the current era, is a testament to the combination of their military capabilities, their strategic foresight, and the particular advantages their technology and access to the webway provides. But it is a survival purchased at extraordinary cost, and Iyondan's post-Kraken state is a permanent reminder of how high that cost can be. Extended section: the Great Rift's second effect isolation and the swarm's uneven advance. The Cicatrix Maledictum did not simply contaminate parts of the galaxy's biomass with chaos energy. It also did something arguably just as significant to the strategic picture. It cut the galaxy in half. The Great Rift bisects the Milky Way from end to end in a wound that blocks warp travel and communication across its full width, separating the galaxy into Imperium Nihilus, the Starless Dark, and the Imperium Sanctus on the side that still has reliable access to Terra and the Astronomicon. For the Tyranids, this development is complex in its implications. On one hand, the isolation of Imperium Nihilus has made significant portions of the galaxy far more vulnerable. Worlds cut off from reinforcement, unable to call for help, facing the swarm with only local resources. These are exactly the conditions that maximize Tyranid efficiency. Hive Fleet Leviathan has been extremely active in Nihilus, consuming world after world in regions where the coordinated Imperial response that previously slowed the advance simply cannot be assembled. But there is also an interesting dynamic on the other side of the ledger. The Rift's disruption of warp travel means that the Tyranids' own biological travel systems, which, as established, do not rely on the warp, give them a mobility advantage relative to their opponents that is greater than it was before. In a galaxy where interstellar travel was largely unimpeded, the Imperium could reinforce threatened worlds faster than the Hive fleets could consume them if the warning arrived in time. With warp travel disrupted, that advantage is reduced, and the Tyranids' warp-independent mobility becomes even more significant. The emergence of the Primaris Space Marines and the broader military reorganization of the Indomitus Crusade under Roboute Guilliman returned from stasis to lead humanity's response to the accumulated disasters of the current era represents the Imperium's attempt to reconstitute its Konza, strategic capacity, in the post-Rift environment. Whether those efforts will be sufficient in the face of multiple simultaneous threats, including the escalating Tyranid advance, the Necron awakening, and the continued pressures of chaos, remains genuinely uncertain within the lore. The Great Rift also created the conditions under which Hive Fleet Kronos emerged, as already discussed, and its ongoing effects continue to shape the strategic picture in ways that favor neither side clearly. What it has done is raise the stakes. Before the Rift, the threat was vast, but the response mechanisms were clearer. After the Rift, the galaxy is fighting multiple existential-level threats simultaneously, with reduced capacity to concentrate force against any single one of them. And the Tyranid advance is only one of the many fires that the galaxy's defenders are trying to manage with insufficient resources. The Hive Mind, in this environment, demonstrates something that might be called opportunism. Where the Rift has isolated worlds, those worlds are targeted. Where the defensive infrastructure is weakest, the tendrils probe deepest. The cold intelligence of the swarm assesses the available prey and routes toward the most accessible and richest targets, adapting continuously to the shifting strategic picture. It does not hesitate because the galaxy is in crisis. If anything, crisis favors the swarm, because crisis degrades the organized resistance that represents the only effective check on the advance. Extended section. What the Imperium knows and does not know, the intelligence war against the swarm. One dimension of the Tyranid threat that deserves exploration is the fundamental epistemic problem that the Imperium faces in dealing with it. Fighting the Tyranids is not just a military challenge. It is an intelligence challenge of extraordinary difficulty, made harder by the specific nature of the Hive Mind's operating architecture. The Hive Mind does not communicate the way other commanders do. There are no Vox transmissions to intercept, no written orders to capture, no political negotiations or diplomatic correspondence to analyze. The synapse web is purely psychic, operating in a frequency and modality that human technology cannot directly eavesdrop on. The Hive Mind tells its organisms what to do through a channel that is, from an imperial intelligence perspective, completely opaque. This creates a situation where the Imperium is perpetually reacting rather than anticipating. By the time a Hive fleet's approach is detected, the shadow in the warp has usually already fallen on the target systems, cutting off communication and preventing the kind of coordinated warning that might allow a full defensive mobilization before the swarm arrives. The timeline from detection to invasion is almost always shorter than the time needed to prepare a fully effective defense. There are exceptions. Inquisitor Cryptman, whose work in the lead-up to the Second Tyrannic War represents one of the Imperium's most significant exercises in Tyranid intelligence gathering, managed to track Hive Fleet Behemoth before it reached Macragge by following the trail of stripped worlds and analyzing the patterns of the fleet's advance. This early warning gave Calgar the time to fortify Macragge, to position the naval assets, to prepare the kind of layered defense that Behemoth's frontal assault could be bled against. Without Cryptman's analysis, the Battle of Macragge might have looked very different. The Ordo Xenos, the Inquisition branch dedicated to studying and combating alien threats, has made the development of Tyranid counterintelligence a major operational focus, understanding the biology of individual bioforms, mapping the distribution of synapse creatures in observed swarms, tracking the genetic adaptation of new bioforms, and inferring from those adaptations what threat the Hive Mind recently encountered and found significant. Identifying the behavioral signatures that indicate a gene-stealer cult is operating in a population. These are the tools of the intelligence war against the swarm, and they are extraordinarily difficult to employ, given the nature of the enemy. The Death Watch's institutional knowledge accumulated across centuries of anti-Xenos operations, preserved in archives that represent some of the most comprehensive military analysis of the Tyranid threat anywhere in the Imperium, is one of the galaxy's most valuable strategic resources. Kill teams returning from operations against Tyranid forces bring back not just kills, but data, behavioral observations, biological specimens where possible, tactical assessments of which weapons and approaches were most effective against which bioforms. This data feeds into a continuous analytical process that tries to stay ahead of the swarm's adaptive curve. The fundamental challenge remains. The Hive Mind adapts faster than the intelligence cycle can turn. A new bioform encountered in one engagement might be specifically countered in the next if the data gets back to the right analysts in time. But the swarm is operating on multiple fronts simultaneously, and the same bioform innovation might appear at a dozen engagements, before a systematic counter-strategy is developed. The window between the appearance of a new threat and the development of an effective response is always a period of elevated danger, and the hive mind has learned over the course of 3 tyrannic wars to exploit those windows. What the Imperium has that the hive mind cannot easily replicate is cultural memory and the capacity for self-reflective strategic adaptation. Marneus Calgar, fighting his 2nd tyrannic war, brought to Ichar 4 something no Tyranid bioform could be evolved to carry: the memory of Macragge. Not just the tactical knowledge of what had worked, but the contextual judgment about when to apply it. The ability to recognize the moment when the synapse web was vulnerable to disruption, and to act on that recognition with the kind of decisive commitment that turns tactical opportunities into strategic results. The hive mind's adaptation is biological. The Imperium's best counter-adaptation is experiential, carried in the minds of survivors and veterans and analysts who have faced the swarm and lived to think about it carefully. That is a slender advantage. But in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, slender advantages are sometimes all that stands between survival and oblivion. Extended section. The Swarm Lord, the hive mind's answer to human adaptation. If the hive mind's greatest strategic vulnerability is the tendency of its opponents to learn to accumulate experience, develop specialized tactics, build institutional knowledge that persists beyond individual engagements, then the Swarm Lord is the hive mind's answer to that problem. The Swarm Lord is not simply a very large hive tyrant, though it is certainly that. It is not simply the most powerful individual combatant the Tyranids can field, though it occupies that position as well. The Swarm Lord is something qualitatively different. It is the hive mind's attempt to create an equivalent of the kind of experienced, adaptive, individual intelligence that the Imperium's great commanders represent. The hive mind is vast, but its intelligence is distributed and general. It processes information from trillions of organisms simultaneously and manages strategic priorities across multiple invasion fronts. What it is less good at is the specific, contextual judgment that an experienced individual commander brings to a single engagement, the ability to read a specific battlefield, respond to the particular personalities and tendencies of specific opponents, recognize the exact moment when a feint becomes an opportunity, and seize it. This is the quality that Calgar demonstrated at Macragge and Ichar 4. This is the quality that great Imperial commanders throughout the Tyrannic Wars have brought to their defenses. The Swarm Lord is the hive mind's attempt to create that quality in a Tyranid organism. Its tactical intelligence is qualitatively different from that of a standard hive tyrant, more flexible, more responsive to individual circumstances, capable of the kind of intuitive tactical adaptation that is normally the province of experienced mortal commanders. It has memory that persists across incarnations. When a Swarm Lord is killed, the hive mind reincorporates its patterns into a new organism, carrying forward the tactical understanding and accumulated experience from the previous form. It grows wiser with each death. It becomes harder to kill as it learns from the methods that killed it before. This means that fighting the Swarm Lord is a particular kind of nightmare. Every time you find a tactic that defeats it, you have contributed to making the next version of it better. Every creative approach that works once is analyzed and countered in the next engagement. The Swarm Lord is the hive mind's living library of how not to be killed by the galaxy's best warriors, constantly updated through its own deaths and rebirths. The Blood Angels chapter, Master Dante, one of the oldest and most experienced warriors in the Imperium, has faced the Swarm Lord on multiple occasions. Guy Haley's novel about that conflict contains one of the most haunting moments in recent 40K fiction. The moment when Dante looks into the Swarm Lord's eyes and perceives beyond the alien malevolence, something he recognizes: a depth, an accumulated weight, the reflection of someone who has been doing this for a very long time and has thought about it very carefully. The Swarm Lord is the hive mind, acknowledging that pure biological mass and adaptation are not sufficient. That individual tactical intelligence of a specific, contextual quality is a resource the swarm needs. That creating it required the hive mind to build something almost unprecedented in Tyranid biology, an organism whose value is not measured in combat effectiveness or synapse capacity, but in accumulated wisdom. That acknowledgement, embedded in the Swarmlord's very existence, is itself a kind of fear response. The Hive Mind recognized something it lacked, something that had cost it victories, and built a tool to address it. That is the behavioral signature of something that takes the quality of its opponents seriously. Extended section. The Hive Fleet's relationship with death, what the recycling of the dead reveals. There is one more dimension of Tyranid biology that speaks directly to the question of what the Hive Mind fears. And it is one that is easy to overlook because it seems at first like just another piece of biological efficiency. The Tyranids recycle their dead. Every organism that falls on the battlefield, if the swarm holds the ground long enough after the fight, is broken down and reabsorbed. The biological material in that dead organism, the muscle tissue and shell, and the organic complexity built into every Tyranid bioform, is gathered by the swarm's smaller organisms, the ones whose sole purpose is exactly this kind of biological reclamation, and fed back into the Hive Fleet's forge processes. This is not a minor feature. It is central to how the swarm sustains itself through extended campaigns. The losses that any army incurs in battle represent, for the Tyranids, not just a reduction in fighting strength, but a temporary displacement of biological resource that returns to the pool when the battlefield is controlled long enough to allow reclamation. An imperial force that retreats and abandons its dead is leaving behind bodies that will be broken down and repurposed. An imperial victory that holds the field and destroys or removes Tyranid corpses is denying the swarm one of its primary recycling streams. The implications for how to fight the Tyranids are real and have been incorporated into advanced imperial defensive doctrine. Flame weapons that reduce organic material to ash that cannot be reassembled. Acid and chemical weapons that denature the proteins in Tyranid corpses beyond the point where reclamation processes can work with them. The sustained holding of battlefields after engagements specifically to prevent reclamation. All of these represent applications of biomass denial thinking at the individual engagement level rather than the strategic level. But the biological recycling system also tells us something about the Hive Mind's relationship with death as a concept. For the swarm, individual death is not a loss to be grieved or even particularly noticed. It is a phase change, the transition of biological material from active organism to raw resource. The matter does not disappear. It remains part of the hive, just in a different form. There is no individual consciousness attached to it that persists and needs to be accounted for. The Tyranid does not die in the way a human dies, carrying a soul that departs to some other place. It becomes substrate. This is why the Chaos Gods cannot benefit from Tyranid deaths in the way they benefit from the deaths of mortal, warp-connected beings. There is no soul stuff to harvest. There is no spiritual resonance from an ending that was not experienced as an ending by anything capable of experience. The death of a Tyranid generates essentially nothing for any warp entity looking to feed on the echoes of mortality. It also means the Hive Mind is genuinely without fear of its own deaths in any individual sense. It does not mourn its losses. It does not experience the kind of despair that a mortal army experiences when it watches its numbers dwindle. There is no morale in the Tyranid swarm, no psychological dimension that can be broken through the accumulation of casualties. Killing Tyranids is only effective in the mechanical, arithmetic sense of reducing their combat capability, not in the psychological sense of wearing down a will to fight. What this means for the fear question is that the things that break ordinary armies, grinding casualty rates, the death of beloved commanders, the visible suffering of comrades, none of these register as fear triggers for the Hive Mind. The Hive Mind's fear responses are structural and strategic, not emotional. It fears the disruption of its command architecture. It fears the contamination of its food supply. It fears the exhaustion of its biological reserves. It fears whatever is behind it in the void. Understanding this asymmetry is essential to understanding why the Tyranids are so deeply unsettling at a philosophical level, beyond the immediate physical horror of what they do to the worlds they consume. They represent an opponent that cannot be intimidated, cannot be demoralized, cannot be worn down psychologically. The only thing you can do is break the mathematics of their advance, make the cost of attacking you higher than the biological gain. And doing that, consistently, against an enemy of this scale and this adaptability, is one of the hardest military problems in the setting. Extended section. The Tau's diplomatic failure. When reason meets hunger. Among the many species of the Warhammer 40,000 galaxy, the Tau occupy a peculiar position. They are newcomers in galactic terms, a very young species compared to the ancient beings that dominate most of the setting's political landscape, but they are possessed of a technological sophistication and a philosophical approach to interstellar relations that is genuinely unusual. The Tau believe in diplomacy. They believe in alliances. They have built a multi-species empire through a combination of military force and genuine ideological persuasion, convincing formerly hostile species that joining the greater good is better than the alternatives. They attempted, at various points, to apply this approach to the Tyranids. The results were predictable from an outside perspective, but the Tau did not have the outside perspective when they made the attempt. What they had was a communication technology that could reach even species whose biological and psychological substrate was radically different from their own, and a genuine belief that any sufficiently complex consciousness could be reasoned with if you could only find the right framework. The Tyranids are not a consciousness that can be reasoned with. The early Tau diplomatic probes toward what they initially identified as an unknown Xenos fleet were simply absorbed. The vessels sent to make contact were torn apart and processed. The psychic emanations that might carry a signal to the Hive Mind were overwhelmed by the shadow in the warp before they could reach anything like a receptive receiver. The Tau got nothing back because the Hive Mind processes diplomatic approaches the way it processes everything else, as biological material of varying quality. The experience left the Tau with an unusual problem. They are a species genuinely committed to the idea that conflict can be resolved through communication, that opponents can become partners, that the galaxy's various intelligent species can find common ground. The Tyranids represent an absolute, unambiguous refutation of every single one of those principles. They are what happens when you encounter something that simply does not share any of the underlying assumptions that make negotiation possible: no interest in mutual survival, no capacity for the kind of reciprocal reasoning that agreements require, no recognition of any value in any other being beyond its caloric content. Tau commanders who have subsequently fought Tyranid forces report a particular kind of horror at the experience, not just the physical danger, which their firepower is well suited to address, but the philosophical shock of encountering something that cannot be communicated with at any level. The greater good's entire worldview is predicated on the idea that communication is possible, that shared frameworks can be found, that understanding leads to resolution. The Tyranids make mockery of that worldview simply by existing, by being exactly what they are with complete consistency, never offering the slightest hint that another approach might produce different results. This experience has shaped Tau strategic doctrine in the subsequent era. They no longer attempt diplomacy with Tyranid forces. They have adopted, with some reluctance and considerable philosophical discomfort, a posture of pure military resistance against the swarm, deploying their considerable ranged firepower against Tyranid organisms with the cold efficiency that the situation demands. But the experience left marks. The optimism that characterizes so much of Tau philosophy is slightly dimmer in the light of what they learned from those early contacts. What the Tau's experience illuminates about the Tyranids is the completeness of the swarm's alienness. Most opponents in Warhammer 40,000 are understandable at some level. The Chaos Gods are alien and terrible, but they have desires, appetites, aesthetic preferences, long-term goals that make a certain kind of sense, even if that sense is deeply destructive. The Necrons are cold and dangerous, but Sarek has comprehensible motivations: guilt, duty, the dream of reversing what was done to his people. Even the Orcs, for all their brutal simplicity, have a comprehensible joy in conflict that makes them legible as a type of being. The Tyranids have nothing like this. They are the reduction of all the complexity of life to a single drive, expressed at a scale that beggars imagination. That purity is what makes them genuinely terrifying in a way that more complex opponents, however dangerous, cannot quite match. Extended section: Deathwatch kill teams and the art of surgical war. The Deathwatch occupies a position in the war against the Tyranids that deserves more attention than it typically receives in broad-brush discussions of the conflict. They are not the force that wins the pitched battles. That is the job of the Astra Militarum and the Space Marine chapters, deployed for mass engagements. The Death Watch exists to do something more subtle, and, in many ways, more important. They go after the things that mass force cannot effectively reach. A Death Watch kill team typically numbers between 5 and 10 Space Marines, drawn from different chapters and carrying between them a diversity of specializations that no single chapter could provide. A librarian from the Blood Angels, who has studied Tyranid psychic patterns for decades, capable of detecting the psychic signature of synapse creatures through the noise of an active battle. An Iron Hands Tech Marine, who has analyzed Tyranid biomorphology extensively and can identify the specific variants of Hive Tyrant that carry the most critical synapse function. A Space Wolf Bloodclaw, whose tracking instincts, honed against prey across a dozen worlds, can find a specific organism in the chaos of a swarm assault. A Salamander veteran whose mastery of flame weapons allows him to deny biomass at a tactical level with surgical precision. Together, these specialists can accomplish things that no comparably sized force in the Imperium can match. They can enter a Tyranid-infested zone, navigate the chaos of an active assault, identify the specific synapse node that is critical to the current tactical coordination of the swarm, and destroy it. The results of such a strike are disproportionate to the size of the team involved. A kill team that successfully assassinates a Hive Tyrant during the critical phase of a planetary assault can break the synapse web in that sector, reduce the swarm's coordinated assault to disorganized animal aggression, and create the window through which a much larger Imperial force can push a counterattack through. The Death Watch's archives on Tyranid biology are among the most comprehensive in the galaxy, accumulated over centuries of operations and constantly updated with new data from the field. Every kill team that returns from an anti-Tyranid mission contributes to this archive: biological samples where they can be safely taken, tactical assessments of new bioforms encountered, analysis of what worked and what did not. Over generations, this institutional knowledge has developed into something genuinely valuable, a living understanding of the enemy that adapts, if more slowly than the Hive Mind, to the constant evolution of the swarm. The Death Watch also plays a critical role in the intelligence war discussed earlier, specifically in the detection and elimination of genostealer cults before they can mature to the point of outbreak. Operating in civilian populations, identifying hybrid individuals, tracing the cult's network back to the Patriarch, and executing the elimination with enough care not to alert the remaining members. This is work that requires exactly the combination of skills and specializations that the Death Watch is built to provide. The existence of the Death Watch and the specifically counter-Tyranid capabilities it has developed represents one of the most direct acknowledgments in the Imperium's military doctrine that the standard approaches are not sufficient. You cannot fight the Tyranids the same way you fight other enemies. They require specialized thinking, specialized equipment, specialized tactical approaches built around their specific vulnerabilities rather than the general principles that work against most opponents. The Death Watch is the Imperium's institutionalized acknowledgement that the standard playbook needs a very different chapter when the enemy is the Great Devourer. Extended section: the Third Tyrannic War and the current state of the conflict. The Third Tyrannic War represents the ongoing front of the conflict between the Imperium and Hive Fleet Leviathan, the largest and most dangerous Hive fleet yet encountered, which attacked from below the galactic plane in 997, M41, and has been pressing inward through Imperium territory ever since. Where Behemoth and Kraken had attacked from the eastern fringe, Leviathan's approach from below the galactic plane was specifically designed to avoid the defensive positions the Imperium had spent 2 centuries building to meet the expected direction of the next incursion. Leviathan is enormous. Estimates of its size, drawn from the shadow, in the warp it casts, and the rate at which it consumes worlds along multiple fronts simultaneously, suggest it is larger than Behemoth and Kraken combined. It attacks along multiple vectors simultaneously, in the dispersed tendril approach that Kraken pioneered, but at a scale that makes Kraken's multi-front assault look conservative by comparison. It has pushed deeper into Imperial space than any previous Hive fleet, reaching into regions that the Imperium had previously considered relatively safe from Tyranid incursion. The current narrative era of the setting, the Era Indomitus, following the formation of the Great Rift and the return of Robut Guilliman, sees the Imperium locked in the desperate work of responding to the accumulated disasters of the 41st millennium, including Leviathan's ongoing advance. Guilliman's Indomitus crusade was partly driven by the need to reinforce and reclaim worlds that had fallen to Leviathan in the opening years of the era. Hive Fleet Kronos, as already discussed, represents the Hive Mind's own tactical response to the complications the Great Rift has introduced. Essentially, a subfleet splintered from Leviathan and repurposed for the anti-chaos clearance mission, following Leviathan's main advance and consuming the worlds that Leviathan's tendrils soften up, but that chaos contamination makes unavailable for direct consumption without first clearing the daemonic presence. The cumulative picture of the current strategic situation is one of a galaxy under enormous, simultaneous pressure from multiple directions, with the Tyranid advance as one of the major ongoing crises among several. The Imperium is not simply fighting Leviathan. It is fighting the resurgent Chaos Marines in the wake of the Great Rift, the awakening Necron dynasties who are reclaiming their tomb worlds, the perpetual pressure of orc incursions, and the internal crises of a civilization that spent the end of the 41st millennium under stresses that would have broken most political structures entirely. In this environment, the Tyranid threat is not the only priority, even though it is arguably the most existentially severe. And that itself is something the Hive Mind, in its cold calculating way, is presumably exploiting. Every resource the Imperium commits to the Chaos Front is a resource not available for the Tyranid Front. Every world lost to a Necron awakening is a world that cannot provide the defensive forces needed against the swarm. The multiple simultaneous crises of the current era create a distribution of Imperial military capacity across too many fronts to be decisive against any single one of them. The Hive Mind does not care about any of the Imperium's other problems, except in the sense that those problems reduce the effectiveness of the opposition. It simply advances, consuming as it goes, probing for weaknesses, filling the defensive gaps created by the Imperium's need to fight everywhere at once. In the current era, with the galaxy under unprecedented stress, those gaps are larger and more numerous than they have ever been. Whether Leviathan can ultimately be stopped is one of the most genuinely uncertain questions in the setting's current narrative. The battles are ongoing, the outcome is unresolved, and the Hive Mind, patient and adaptive and vast and very hungry, keeps coming.